Across the vast expanse of the North American continent lie two immense nations, the United States and Canada, sharing the longest undefended border in the world. For generations, this border has largely been perceived as a permanent, immutable line on the map, dividing two distinct sovereign entities. But what if that perception of permanence is not as absolute as it seems? What if, driven by growing dissatisfaction with the political climate in Washington, a desire for different social or economic policies, or simply a profound cultural affinity, certain U.S. states were to actually consider the unthinkable, breaking away from the Union and aligning their future with their northern neighbor? While the idea might sound like something out of a fictional political thriller, the truth is that some U.S. states already possess remarkably deep economic, cultural, and even political ties to Canada, connections that, for some, could theoretically form the basis for such a radical realignment under specific circumstances. Think about the possibilities. What if the independent streak of Vermont, coupled with its progressive politics and close proximity to Quebec, led it to seriously consider parting ways with the United States? What if the distinct northern charm and deep economic integration of a state like Minnesota felt a stronger sense of belonging with Canada than with the diverse and often distant parts of the U.S.? And what about Alaska, already physically cut off from the contiguous United States, with its economy and infrastructure intertwined with Canada? Some of these scenarios might seem far-fetched at first glance, defying conventional political wisdom. But for others, upon closer examination, the underlying signs of potential divergence and deep Canadian connection are already noticeably present. We delve into the fascinating, albeit speculative, question of which U.S. states might, under certain conditions, be most likely to consider such a dramatic geopolitical shift, breaking down the compelling factors that tie them closely to Canada. Vermont, what? If, hypothetically, an entire state within the American Union already possessed a fundamental character and a set of values that felt, in many significant ways, more aligned with Canada than with the broader United States. When thinking of Vermont, images of rolling hillsides blanketed in snow or vibrant autumn colors, charming small towns with white-steepled churches, and the sweet taste of maple syrup often come to mind. But upon closer inspection, these idyllic qualities are intertwined with deeper characteristics, a strong sense of community, a certain pragmatic independence, and a political orientation that resonate strongly with aspects of Canadian identity, particularly that of neighboring Quebec. It is precisely this unique blend of factors that leads some to ponder if Vermont could, under certain hypothetical future conditions, be the first U.S. state to seriously consider saying goodbye to America. Vermont has a long and distinctive history marked by a strong vein of independence. Before formally joining the U.S. Union in 1791 as the 14th state, it existed for 14 years as its own independent entity, the Vermont Republic, a period that instilled a lasting tradition of self-reliance and a certain distance from external authority. This historical precedent of sovereign existence, while distant, is sometimes invoked by modern movements advocating for greater autonomy. Politically, modern Vermont leans heavily towards progressive policies, consistently ranking among the most liberal states in the U.S. Its stances on issues like health care, environmental protection, social welfare programs, and civil liberties often align more closely with the political mainstream in Canada, particularly the social democratic traditions found in many Canadian provinces, than they do with the more conservative or centrist national political landscape of the United States. This ideological alignment creates a certain cultural and political comfort level with Canadian approaches to governance and social issues. Here is where the hypothetical scenario gains interesting traction: the existence of resident movements already actively advocating for separation. A group known as the Second Vermont Republic has for years been openly promoting the idea of Vermont's peaceful secession from the United States, arguing that the state's unique values, economic structure, and political identity would be better served by operating as an independent nation, potentially in closer association with Canada. While this movement is considered fringe by many, the fact that it exists and openly discusses secession keeps the idea, however distant, in the public discourse for a segment of the population. Adding to this are the strong economic ties with neighboring Quebec. Vermont's economy, while small, has significant cross-border connections, particularly in areas like trade, tourism, and even some shared infrastructure. There is a shared appreciation for locally sourced products, outdoor recreation that transcends the border, and a cultural overlap influenced by proximity. When you combine this existing independent streak, the strong political alignment with Canadian values, the active, albeit niche, secessionist movement, and tangible economic and cultural ties with Quebec, the idea of Vermont hypothetically breaking away from the US to seek a different path, perhaps one more closely tied to Canada, doesn't seem entirely confined to the realm of pure fantasy. While a dramatic political divorce is far from imminent, the specific circumstances of Vermont's history, geography, and political culture make it a unique case for such speculation. Potentially, America's first real secession consideration in centuries, albeit under highly specific and unlikely future conditions. Maine. You might be genuinely shocked to discover the extent to which one particular U.S. state, nestled in the far northeastern corner of the country, is already deeply interdependent with its northern neighbor Canada for essential services and economic vitality. Without this crucial relationship, the state would face significant challenges, struggling even to literally keep the lights on. That state is Maine, and its profound reliance on Canada, particularly the province of Quebec, is a compelling factor in considering its unique position within the U.S. Maine imports a significant portion of its electricity from hydroelectric sources in Quebec via extensive transmission lines, a reliance that underscores a fundamental infrastructure connection crossing the international border. Furthermore, Maine's economy thrives significantly on cross-border trade and economic interaction. Billions of dollars worth of goods flow between Maine and Canada every year, encompassing a wide range of products from forestry and paper goods to manufactured items and seafood. In fact, reports indicate that over $3 billion worth of goods annually travel across the border, making Canada an absolutely vital trading partner for Maine businesses and industries. Beyond the crucial economic and infrastructural ties culturally, Maine arguably feels more akin to Canada than it does to many other parts of the United States, particularly those in the south or west. Its rugged coastline, dotted with picturesque fishing towns and characterized by a certain hardy, self-sufficient character, shares much in common with the coastal provinces of Atlantic Canada, particularly New Brunswick, with which Maine shares a land border. Maine also has pockets of French-speaking communities, particularly in the northern part of the state, a direct linguistic and cultural link to Quebec and other French-speaking parts of Canada. This cultural overlap creates a natural affinity and ease of interaction that transcends the political border, making Maine feel geographically and culturally closer to New Brunswick, for instance, than it might feel to states like Texas or Arizona, which represent vastly different regions and ways of life within the U.S. Even politically, there is a degree of alignment. While Maine's political landscape is complex and includes conservative areas, the state often aligns more closely with certain social and environmental policies common in Canada than it does with the political mainstream in Washington on various issues. This shared approach to certain policy areas can foster a sense of commonality in governance philosophies. And let's not forget a historical precedent for separation. Maine was not always an independent state within the U.S. It was once a district of Massachusetts until it successfully split off to become its own state in 1820. This historical act of separation, while distinct from joining another country, demonstrates that the boundaries of Maine have changed in the past. While the idea of Maine leaving the U.S. to join Canada remains firmly in the realm of speculation, the undeniable economic lifeline provided by Canada, the deep cultural connections, and the history of redefining its political boundaries collectively contribute to making Maine a state with a unique and profound relationship with its northern neighbor, a relationship so essential that it prompts intriguing hypothetical questions about future alignment, particularly if broader political or economic stability within the U.S. were ever to be severely challenged. New Hampshire. What if a state that has always fiercely prided itself on its independence, even enshrining the motto, "Live free or die," as a central tenet of its identity, decided to take that independent spirit to its ultimate theoretical conclusion? This isn't just a catchy slogan on license plates. In New Hampshire, it represents a deeply ingrained way of life for many residents. The state has consistently demonstrated a certain resistance to federal control, a strong preference for low taxes, and a palpable libertarian undercurrent that shapes its political landscape in ways that often don't neatly align with the rest of the U.S. But what if this powerful drive for independence were to hypothetically lead it away from the United States entirely? What if a state were to conclude, under certain future conditions, that it no longer needed to be part of the American Union? New Hampshire already embodies many of the characteristics that might lead to such a radical thought process. It actively resists federal mandates and regulations in various forms, champions fiscal conservatism with its lack of broad-based income or sales taxes, and places an exceptionally high value on individual liberties and personal freedom, sometimes to an extent that feels more in line with the decentralized nature of Canada's federal system, which grants significant autonomy to its provinces than with the often more centralized authority of Washington, D.C. And guess what? The notion of secession, while niche, is not entirely absent from the political discourse within New Hampshire. This isn't just some abstract or wild theory discussed in hushed tones. In 2022, a group of state lawmakers actually took the significant step of formally proposing an amendment to the state constitution that would have put the question of secession from the United States directly on the ballot for the state's voters to decide. While the amendment ultimately did not pass and gain the necessary support to move forward, the very fact that the idea was formally debated within the state legislature, a legitimate governmental body, is a powerful indicator that the concept of leaving the Union, however improbable, is not entirely outside the realm of consideration for some within New Hampshire. New Hampshire has consistently stood out as different from many other U.S. states. Its unique tax structure, rooted in a deep-seated resistance to taxation, is a defining feature. The live free or die mentality fosters a culture of self-reliance and skepticism towards governmental overreach. But here is where the hypothetical connection to Canada becomes even more intriguing. New Hampshire's economy is already deeply and significantly tied to Canada. Substantial trade flows occur between the two annually, reportedly exceeding $8 billion worth of goods moving across the border every year. Many businesses within the state, particularly those in sectors like manufacturing, technology, and forestry, rely on these Canadian partnerships for supply chains, markets, or investment to survive and thrive. Plus, culturally, New Hampshire, like its northern New England neighbors, shares more in common with parts of Canada, particularly the maritime provinces and Quebec, than it might with distant states in other regions of the U.S. It is a relatively small, predominantly rural state, with a strong appreciation for the outdoors, a culture that embraces winter sports and activities, and a powerful sense of regional identity that often feels distinct from the national American identity. And let's not forget the historical role of political movements in shaping New Hampshire's identity. The Free State Project, a long-running political migration movement encouraging libertarians to move to New Hampshire to concentrate their numbers and push for limited government and expanded individual freedoms, has already made significant waves in the state's political landscape. But what if the next, even more radical, step for some within this movement or others driven by similar principles wasn't just resisting federal policies or shrinking the size of government, but contemplating leaving the United States altogether to align with a system perceived as more decentralized or less intrusive? It might sound extreme to most, but in a state where independence is not just a slogan, but a deeply held value and a way of life, where secession has been formally debated, and where economic and cultural ties to Canada are strong, anything, however improbable it may seem from the outside, is arguably possible under certain hypothetical future conditions of profound national change. Minnesota, You might be surprised to learn just how profoundly connected one particular US state, located in the upper Midwest, is to Canada. So much so that the hypothetical idea of it leaving the United States to join its northern neighbor might, under specific circumstances, actually seem to make a certain kind of sense to some residents. This state possesses deep and long-standing economic ties, a palpable shared culture, and a population whose accent and demeanor, believe it or not, sometimes lead outsiders to mistake them for being Canadian. That state is Minnesota, and its unique relationship with Canada warrants closer examination in the context of this hypothetical scenario. Let's break down these connections. Geographically, Minnesota shares a substantial border with Canada, stretching for nearly 550 miles, primarily with the provinces of Manitoba and Ontario. This shared geography facilitates interaction and exchange. Economically, Canada is undeniably Minnesota's largest and most crucial trading partner. The volume of goods flowing across this border is immense. In 2023 alone, Minnesota reportedly exported over $7 billion worth of goods to Canada, making cross-border trade an absolutely vital lifeline for numerous industries and businesses within the state, from agriculture and manufacturing to technology and mining. This level of economic interdependence creates a strong, practical link to the Canadian economy. But the connection is far from being purely transactional or economic. Minnesota and Canada also share a remarkably similar lifestyle and cultural sensibility, particularly with the neighboring prairie provinces in Ontario. The people of Minnesota are often characterized by their friendliness, politeness, and a certain reserved quality that many observers find distinctly Canadian. They possess a deep love for the outdoors, embracing activities like fishing, hunting, and spending time at lakes and forests. Minnesotans are also known for their unique regional accent, which shares certain phonological similarities with Canadian English, leading to frequent cases of mistaken identity when traveling in other parts of the US. And of course, there is a shared passion for hockey, a sport that is practically a religion in both Minnesota and Canada, fostering a cultural bond. Furthermore, the political leanings in Minnesota often align more closely with the progressive social and environmental policies common in Canadian provincial and federal politics than they do with the often more conservative political mainstream in many other parts of the United States. This shared political orientation can create a sense of ideological kinship. And guess what? There is historical depth to this connection. Before Minnesota officially became a U.S. state in 1858, parts of its territory were actually under the nominal governance of the British Crown, and the lucrative fur trade industry that dominated the Sioux region was heavily tied to Canadian companies like the Hudson's Bay Company. Even today, many Minnesotans reportedly hold dual U.S.-Canadian citizenship or have close family ties to Canadians living just across the border, reflecting generations of migration and interaction. Some experts and commentators have suggested, in purely speculative terms, that if the United States were ever to face a period of profound political turmoil, national fracturing, or significant economic collapse, Minnesota, with its deep and practical connections to Canada, would be one of the U.S. states most likely to seriously consider alternative options for its future, perhaps exploring scenarios that involve closer alignment with its stable northern neighbor. Given its existing economic dependencies, cultural similarities, and historical links, it would not be surprising if, in such a hypothetical crisis, a significant segment of the population or political leadership started looking northwards instead, of west or south for potential solutions or a different future. North Dakota, what if, under certain specific and hypothetical future circumstances, an entire U.S. state were to find itself in a position where its economic lifeline and essential services were more profoundly reliant on a foreign country than on its own national government. While it might sound like a far-fetched premise for a political thought experiment, examining the reality of North Dakota's relationship with Canada suggests that this state is, perhaps surprisingly, in a situation where its economy is practically glued to that of its northern neighbor. This state, often perceived by outsiders as a quiet, agricultural, and somewhat forgotten part of America, possesses deep and vital cross-border connections that are often overlooked in national discussions, making it a compelling case for hypothetical scenarios involving future alignment. Here is where the reality of North Dakota's connection to Canada becomes particularly striking. North Dakota reportedly exports more goods to Canada than to any other country in the world, a staggering volume of trade that reaches billions of dollars annually, potentially exceeding $6 billion in certain years. This makes Canada the absolute crucial market for numerous North Dakotan products, from agricultural commodities to manufactured goods and energy resources. But the connection isn't limited to just the flow of goods. Energy infrastructure creates another vital link. Canada supplies a significant portion of North Dakota's power needs, often via transmission lines that cross the border, highlighting a practical reliance for an essential service. Furthermore, agriculture, a cornerstone of North Dakota's identity and economy, is deeply intertwined with Canadian markets. North Dakota farmers depend on Canadian buyers for their produce and livestock, integrating their businesses into a cross-border agricultural ecosystem. Even individual travel and daily life demonstrate this connection. A surprising number of North Dakota residents routinely cross the border into Canada for healthcare services, shopping, and even work, taking advantage of proximity and, in some cases, different service availabilities or costs. In many towns along the extensive border shared with the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you are reportedly just as likely to see a Canadian license plate as you are an American one, a tangible sign of the constant flow of people and interaction. Let's consider the political dimension as well. North Dakota's political culture often emphasizes small government, a pro-business environment, and a pragmatic approach to regulation. These characteristics, combined with its close trade ties and shared regional interests, actually align more closely with the political mindset and economic priorities of Canada's western provinces, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, than they do with the often more ideologically driven or complex political landscape in Washington, D.C. And here is a compelling historical fact that adds another layer to this relationship. At one point in history, there were serious, albeit informal, discussions and proposals about the possibility of North Dakota and the Canadian province of Manitoba merging into a single economic zone or political entity, recognizing their shared geography, resources, and intertwined economies. While that specific idea did not come to fruition, the fact that it was even contemplated underscores the deep historical recognition of their interconnectedness. So, the question arises: what happens if the United States were ever to face a period of significant political or economic crisis, potentially leading to instability or a perceived decline in the effectiveness of the federal government? North Dakota is already profoundly dependent on Canada for its economic well-being, energy needs, and even some personal services for its citizens. In such a hypothetical scenario, where the reliability and stability of the U.S. system might be called into question, could a state so fundamentally tied to a foreign country one day decide that making its cross-border relationship official by seeking a form of alignment or even integration with Canada makes more practical sense for the well-being of its residents and economy? It sounds shocking on the surface, but when a state's essential lifeline is, in practical terms, a foreign country, the question of why it should maintain absolute loyalty to a national system that, from its perspective, might at times seem distant, or barely notice its existence, becomes a point for intriguing, albeit speculative, consideration. Montana. What if there existed a state within the American Union that felt, in many essential ways, as if it had more in common culturally, economically, and even environmentally with Canada than with the rest of the United States? What if its rugged, independent spirit, a hallmark of its identity, led its residents to question, under certain hypothetical future conditions, whether staying within America was truly the right call for their prosperity and way of life? That, it is argued, is exactly the compelling case for Montana, a state whose ties to Canada run deeper than many outsiders realize. Here's the reality of Montana's relationship with Canada. Montana shares a significant border, stretching 545 miles, with 3 Canadian provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. But these provinces are not merely geographical neighbors, they are deeply intertwined economic partners. Trade across this border is substantial. In 2023, Montana reportedly exported over $700 million worth of goods to Canada, making its northern neighbor one of the state's largest and most important trade partners, vital for key Montanan industries. And culturally, the people of Montana share a profound connection with their Canadian counterparts, particularly those in the western provinces. The lifestyle in Montana is deeply rooted in the outdoors, embracing activities like ranching, farming, hunting, fishing, and simply navigating and surviving in a rugged, often demanding natural environment, including enduring brutal winter conditions. This fundamental connection to the land and the challenges it presents creates a way of life that is remarkably similar to that found in Alberta or British Columbia, leading some to jokingly refer to Montana and parts of Western Canada as practically twins, sharing a common frontier spirit and outdoor culture. But guess what? There is historical precedent that highlights Montana's historical connections extending northwards. Back in the 1800s, long before it officially became a U.S. state in 1889, much of the economic activity in the Montana Territory, particularly the lucrative fur trade, was dominated by Canadian companies operating out of the north. This early economic integration established links that, in various forms, have persisted. Even today, many Montanans reportedly have close family ties that span the border, with relatives living in Alberta or other neighboring provinces, and some may even hold dual U.S.-Canadian citizenship, reflecting generations of movement and connection across the seemingly permeable border. The shared cultural values, the similar ways of life shaped by the landscape, and the family connections create a sense of regional identity that often feels distinct from, and in some ways more aligned, with that of Western Canada than with the distant political and cultural centers of the eastern or southern United States. Some Montanans even half-jokingly point out the similarities, noting that while they share a rugged lifestyle with Alberta, Alberta also offers universal health care, a social policy starkly different from the U.S. system. And here is a part of the discussion that nobody within Montana is entirely unaware of. The state is home to a strong and persistent sentiment of skepticism towards, and, in some cases, outright opposition to the federal government in Washington, D.C. Many Montanans feel that Washington is distant, disconnected from their realities, and often ignores their needs and values. This anti-federal government sentiment creates a fertile ground for discussions about greater state autonomy, and in more extreme hypothetical scenarios, could potentially lead some to consider whether being part of a different system, perhaps one perceived as more aligned with their values or economic interests, like Canada's decentralized federalism and integrated Western economy, might be a preferable alternative to remaining within a U.S. system with which they feel increasingly disconnected. If, hypothetically, broader national conditions in the U.S. were ever to deteriorate significantly, prompting states to reconsider their allegiances, who is to say that Montana, with its deep Canadian ties, its independent spirit, and its significant anti-federal government sentiment wouldn't look northwards instead of east or west for a potential future? Washington. Why is it that this particular U.S. state, situated in the Pacific Northwest and globally renowned for its thriving tech industry, its ubiquitous coffee culture, and its stunning natural beauty encompassing mountains, forests, and coastline, feels so profoundly connected to its northern neighbor? Why are its biggest cities already so financially, politically, and culturally intertwined with another nation? Washington isn't merely geographically close to Canada. It is reportedly deeply linked in ways that, when examined closely, might lead one to seriously wonder where its long-term future and allegiances truly lie under certain hypothetical scenarios. Could a significant political or economic shift involving Canada be more likely for Washington than many people outside the region might ever think? The answer, upon considering the depth of these connections, might indeed surprise you. Let's begin with the hard numbers that illustrate the profound economic interdependence. Canada is undeniably Washington State's #1 trading partner by a significant margin. The sheer volume of goods moving between the two jurisdictions is staggering, reportedly exceeding $20 billion in value annually. This isn't just a marginal trade relationship. It represents a full-blown economic dependency, with numerous Washington businesses and industries relying on Canadian markets, supply chains, and investment, and vice versa. Furthermore, Washington relies on Canadian energy resources, with substantial amounts of hydroelectric power flowing south from British Columbia to help meet the state's energy needs, highlighting a critical infrastructure link that crosses the international border. Even Washington's biggest port, the Port of Seattle, which is a major gateway for trade with Asia, is deeply linked to Canadian shipping routes and logistical networks, facilitating the movement of millions of dollars worth of goods not just between the U.S. and Asia, but also between Asia and Canada via U.S. ports, demonstrating a shared regional economic ecosystem. But here is where the relationship reportedly becomes even more complex and intriguing. Washington isn't just financially tied to Canada. It exhibits notable political and social alignment as well. This is consistently one of the most politically progressive states in the U.S., with policy stances on issues such as healthcare access, environmental protection, social services, and labor rights that often bear a closer resemblance to the political approaches and values prevalent in Canada, particularly in British Columbia, than they do to the political mainstream in many other, more conservative parts of the United States. This ideological kinship fosters a certain understanding and ease of cooperation on various policy fronts. Washington State has also actively pursued closer ties and integration with British Columbia, exploring proposals for enhanced transportation infrastructure, including high-speed rail projects that aim to connect cities like Seattle and Vancouver. British Columbia, reducing travel time and further integrating the two metropolitan regions. Some politicians and regional planners have even publicly floated the idea of deeper economic integration and collaboration that goes beyond traditional trade agreements, reflecting a recognition of their shared regional interests and interconnected future. And guess what? The cultural overlap between the Pacific Northwest region of the U.S., including Washington and Oregon, and southwestern Canada, British Columbia, is impossible to ignore. It is a palpable connection felt by residents on both sides of the border. From a shared appreciation for the stunning natural environment and a pervasive outdoor lifestyle, to a concentration of technology-driven economies and a well-known regional coffee culture, the people of Vancouver and Seattle, for instance, share many cultural touchstones and values. In fact, it is not uncommon for British Columbians to live and work in Washington, maintaining close ties to Canada while being functionally integrated into the Washington economy and society, and vice versa. If the United States were ever to face a major political split or significant internal instability that led states to reconsider their place in the Union, it would not be surprising if Washington, with its profound economic dependencies on Canada, its strong political and social alignment with Canadian values, its critical shared infrastructure, and its deep cultural overlap with British Columbia, began to look northwards, towards a potentially more aligned and stable partner instead of east or south within a fractured U.S. Oregon. What if there was a U.S. state that, under certain hypothetical future conditions, felt so profoundly disconnected from the rest of the country, both ideologically and culturally, that its residents and leaders began to seriously consider alternative national affiliations? What if its people, its unique culture, and its economic priorities aligned more closely with those of another nation than with the diverse and sometimes conflicting interests within the United States? That, it is argued, is exactly the intriguing situation potentially unfolding in Oregon, a state in the Pacific Northwest where a sense of distinct regional identity and certain political leanings are leading some to consider possibilities that extend beyond the traditional boundaries of the U.S. The shift in perspective, while not mainstream, is reportedly more serious than many people outside the state might realize. First, let's examine the significant economic ties that bind Oregon to Canada. Oregon's economy depends heavily on trade with its northern neighbor, with a substantial volume of goods moving between the two jurisdictions annually, reportedly exceeding $4 billion in value. This trade is crucial for various Oregon industries, creating a tangible economic link that underscores the state's interconnectedness with the Canadian economy. But here is where the connection reportedly gains a unique dimension that goes beyond simple commerce. Oregon demonstrates closer alignment on significant environmental and social policies with British Columbia, Canada's westernmost province, than it often does with its immediate U.S. neighbors or the federal government in Washington, D.C. The state's progressive stance on issues such as healthcare reform, environmental sustainability and conservation, labor rights and social equity often looks far more akin to the policy approaches and values prevalent in Canada than it does to the often more conservative or varied policy landscape across the broader United States. This shared approach to governance and societal issues creates a sense of ideological kinship with Canada. And guess what? The idea of Oregonians wanting to redefine their state's political boundaries is not entirely new, although the focus has traditionally been different. You have likely heard of the Greater Idaho Movement, a political effort advocating for rural counties in eastern Oregon and Washington to leave their current states and join the more politically conservative state of Idaho, driven by ideological differences with the more liberal urban centers in their current states. But here is an intriguing twist within this broader discussion of boundary changes. Some residents and commentators have publicly argued that while the eastern, rural parts of Oregon might align more with Idaho, the western, more populous and politically progressive parts of the state, particularly the Willamette Valley region, including Portland and Eugene, would hypothetically be better off exploring the possibility of joining Canada. This sounds extreme, certainly, representing a radical departure from the status quo. However, the argument is rooted in the frustration felt by some Oregonians who believe their state's values and policy preferences are consistently at odds with the direction of the federal government and many other U.S. states. At what point, they might ask, do people start looking for a national system and a political culture that actually fits their values and priorities better than the one they are currently part of? And let's not overlook the cultural and geographic resonance. While not sharing a direct land border with Canada, unlike Washington, the cultural similarities between the major urban centers of Western Oregon, particularly Portland and Vancouver, British Columbia, are palpable. From a shared appreciation for the outdoors, a prominent environmental consciousness, and a distinct regional culture centered around coffee, craft beer, and independent arts, the two cities and their surrounding regions feel more connected culturally than Portland might feel to, say, distant urban centers in Texas or Florida, which represent vastly different cultural landscapes within the U.S. So, if a major national crisis or a prolonged period of deep political division were ever to hypothetically force states to seriously reconsider their allegiance and future, don't be shocked if Oregon, with its significant economic ties to Canada, its strong political and social alignment with Canadian values, its existing internal discussions about changing borders, and its cultural resonance with British Columbia, were to seriously consider looking northwards instead of just south or east for a potential alternative future. Alaska. What if there was a U.S. state whose sheer geographic isolation from the rest of the country was so profound that it already, in many practical ways, functioned with a degree of autonomy and faced unique logistical challenges that made it feel somewhat like a separate entity? What if this state's strongest and most vital economic and even military ties were not exclusively with the contiguous United States, but were also deeply and necessarily intertwined with those of another nation entirely? Alaska, often romanticized as America's last frontier, a vast and rugged territory of immense natural beauty and resources, fits this description perhaps more uniquely than any other state. But what if its inherent isolation and its deep connections to Canada meant that it might not necessarily stay American forever under certain highly specific and hypothetical future conditions? How does a state even maintain a strong sense of being American when it is physically cut off by thousands of miles and another country from the rest of the contiguous United States? How does it stay functionally connected and economically viable when its daily life, its infrastructure, and its vital economic activities are, by necessity, more intertwined with another nation? Alaska is geographically closer to Canada than it is to the vast majority of the U.S. mainland, separated by the entire expanse of Canada's western provinces and territories. In fact, the only practical way to drive from Alaska to the rest of the country is by traveling hundreds or thousands of miles through Canada, relying on Canadian roads and infrastructure. And this isn't just about physical location. The state is deeply and fundamentally tied to Canada's economy. Billions of dollars flow between Alaska and Canada annually through the trade of essential resources such as oil, natural gas, seafood, and raw materials extracted from their shared northern landscapes. Some of Alaska's largest fishing operations, a cornerstone of its economy, rely on accessing and operating in waters managed in cooperation with Canada, while Canadian companies hold massive stakes and play significant roles in Alaska's natural resource industries, from mining to energy extraction. But here is where the historical context adds an intriguing layer to this unique situation. Alaska did not always belong to the United States. Before its purchase by the U.S. from Russia in 1867, it was Russian territory. While that historical period might seem unrelated to modern-day Canada, it serves as crucial proof of one major point. Alaska has not always been American territory, and its political affiliation has changed dramatically in the past. This historical reality, combined with its inherent geographic separation and deep integration with Canada, prompts a speculative question. If the United States were ever to face a period of severe internal political upheaval, national fracturing, or significant economic decline, would Alaska choose to try and navigate such a crisis entirely on its own as an independent entity, or would it logically look north, towards Canada, where its economy is already deeply rooted, its infrastructure necessarily connected, and its geography inextricably linked? And guess what? The significant military presence in Alaska, while primarily focused on U.S. defense and strategic projection in the Arctic and Pacific regions, is another crucial factor that involves Canada in a unique way. The state is home to some of the most strategically important U.S. military bases, vital for national defense. However, Canada already plays a major and integrated role in joint defense efforts covering the North American Arctic and beyond. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, a joint U.S.-Canadian organization, integrates Alaskan-based U.S. forces with Canadian forces for aerospace warning and control. This means that in the hypothetical event of a major geopolitical shift or a crisis that impacted the integrity of the U.S., Alaska and Canada would likely be compelled to work together immediately on critical defense and security matters, potentially even before full coordination with the rest of the fragmented U.S. could be established. So, if a hypothetical day ever came when the United States no longer felt like the stable or viable national home for Alaska, perhaps due to internal division or external pressures, don't be shocked if this uniquely positioned state were to seriously consider its options, including the possibility of closer alignment with, or even integration into, Canada. Because when you are already living and operating in ways that, by necessity, resemble those of an independent nation deeply tied to your northern neighbor, making that status official might not seem like such a wild or impossible idea to some. Michigan might be genuinely shocked by the sheer depth of the connection that this particular U.S. state, located in the Great Lakes region, shares with Canada. The ties are so extensive and vital that, in many practical ways, Michigan arguably feels as if it is already an integral part of the Canadian economic and industrial ecosystem. Michigan relies on Canada more fundamentally than perhaps any other U.S. state, a relationship underscored by the truly massive volume of trade that flows across their shared border every single year. Reports indicate that a staggering $80 billion worth of trade moves between Michigan and Canada annually, a figure that highlights an extraordinary level of economic interdependence. The Detroit-Windsor corridor, connecting Michigan's largest city with its Canadian neighbor in Ontario, is not only one of the busiest trade routes in North America, but one of the busiest international border crossings in the world, with thousands of trucks carrying goods crossing daily. If that critical connection were ever to be severely disrupted or cut off, many experts agree that Michigan's economy, particularly its vital manufacturing sector, would face an immediate and potentially catastrophic collapse overnight. And guess what? The automotive industry, which has historically served as Michigan's economic backbone and a cornerstone of its identity, is profoundly dependent on its relationship with Canada. The supply chains and manufacturing processes of major auto companies with operations in both Detroit and Windsor and throughout the wider Michigan-Ontario region are so deeply intertwined that some vehicles are assembled with parts that cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. Many cars sold across North America, including iconic Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler models, are built through a collaborative process involving labor and components from both countries, making the auto industry a powerful symbol of their economic integration. But the essential connections extend beyond just money and manufacturing. Michigan and Canada share crucial infrastructure that is vital for daily life and commerce. This includes the iconic Ambassador Bridge, the busiest border crossing between the two countries, which, notably, is owned by a Canadian billionaire, highlighting the cross-border nature of critical assets. They also share tunnels and, critically, integrated power grids. Michigan relies on Canadian electricity to help meet its energy needs, demonstrating a practical dependence for an essential utility. And here is something that might be truly shocking to those unaware of the historical context. Michigan once, at a pivotal moment in its history, seriously considered the possibility of merging with Canada. Back in the 1830s, following the resolution of the Toledo War, a boundary dispute with Ohio, some Michiganders, disillusioned with the outcome and feeling a certain affinity with their northern neighbors, actually expressed a desire and explored the possibility of joining Canada instead of remaining with the United States. While that historical moment did not lead to a union, the fact that such a sentiment existed and was discussed underscores a historical willingness to consider aligning with Canada. With its economy fundamentally reliant on trade with Canada, its energy needs partially met by Canadian power, its critical infrastructure shared across the border, and even a historical instance of considering joining its northern neighbor, Michigan, in many practical ways, is arguably already operating, with a degree of integration that makes it feel, economically and infrastructurally, much like a Canadian province. The ties are so deep that, under certain hypothetical future conditions of profound national change or economic disruption within the U.S., the question of whether Michigan might one day rethink its place within the American Union and consider an alternative future more closely aligned with Canada becomes a point of serious, albeit speculative, contemplation. So, could these states, with their deep economic ties, shared cultures, political alignments, and even histories of considering separation, actually break away from the United States and join Canada? At first glance, the idea might indeed sound like pure political speculation, an improbable scenario confined to theoretical discussions. However, when you take a closer look at the facts on the ground, the economies that are fundamentally dependent on cross-border trade and energy, the cultural and political alignments that resonate more strongly with their northern neighbor than with distant parts of their own country, and the historical instances where borders have been debated or even redrawn, the connections are undeniably profound and in some cases critical to these states' functioning. If the United States were ever to face a major period of political fragmentation, internal conflict, or severe economic crisis, challenges that tested the very integrity of the Union, who is to say that some of these places, already so intricately linked to Canada, wouldn't seriously consider making a drastic and historically significant move? History has shown us that national borders, while seemingly solid, can change, that allegiances can shift under pressure, and that sometimes what seems like an impossible geopolitical reconfiguration today could, under the right confluence of circumstances, become tomorrow's unexpected reality.